Hello, I'm Kate Trinka, the Global Read Coordinator with the Charter for Compassion. Welcome to today's program with Kristin Neff and Christopher Germer, who will be discussing their book, The Mindful Self-Compassion Workbook. Our host for today's program will be Michael Karlin. But before I introduce them, allow me to tell you about some other upcoming events and the work of the Charter for Compassion, who's bringing you today's program. And of course, we're always grateful for your financial support so we can keep bringing you relevant programming. We have several upcoming courses being hosted by the Charter's Education Institute, including Compassion, Integrity Training, Growing Whole Not Old, and a course on mindful reconnecting with the natural world. Next month, we'll be visiting with Jean Shinoda Bolin to discuss her book, Like a Tree, How Trees, Women, and Tree People Can Save the Planet. And speaking of trees, I'd like to mention a campaign that is near and dear to my heart, the Compassion Tree Project. The Compassion Tree Project is an effort to bring awareness to the need for regenerative efforts around the world. Our ambitious 10-year goal is to plant 7.7 billion trees, in effect, each tree representing every person on the planet. Then in July, we'll be featuring Joanna Macy with her recently released book, A Wild Love for the World. And then Michael Nagler will be joining us in August discussing his book, The Third Harmony, Nonviolence and the New Story of Human Nature. Billy Collins will be with us on 9/11, reading his poetry, including his famous poem, The Names. Sharon Salzberg will also be with us in September, Rianne Eisler in October, Robin Wall Kimmerer in November, and poet Naomi Nye will be here with us in December. We're so grateful that these amazing authors have connected with the Charter for Compassion and are willing to donate their time to us. Please help us spread the word. I'll provide links to all of these programs in our chat room. I encourage you to participate in today's book discussion by using the chat room. It's located at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to type your questions in there, and I will get them to our guests during the last portion of our program. And now it's my pleasure to introduce to you our guest host, Michael Karlin. Michael is Assistant Professor of Psychology at Life University in the Positive Human Development and Social Change Department, and the Associate Director of Life University Center for Compassion, Integrity, and Secular Ethics. Karlin is the co-author of Compassion Integrity Training, a multi-part training program that cultivates basic human values as skills for the purpose of increasing individual, social, and environmental flourishing. Michael received his PhD in Religious Studies and a graduate certificate in Jewish Studies from Emory University in 2014. Welcome, Michael, and thank you for being here with us today.
My pleasure, thank you.
And finally, the reason you're all here, the authors of the Mindful Self-Compassion Workbook, Kristin Neff and Christopher Germer. I'll introduce Kristin first. She's a PhD and Associate Professor of Human Development and Culture at the University of Texas at Austin, and a pioneer in the field of self-compassion research. Her books include the Mindful Self-Compassion Workbook, which is why we're here today, Self-Compassion for the General Public, and Teaching for the Mindful Compassion Program for Professionals. She is also the author of an audio program, Self-Compassion Step by Step, and has published numerous academic articles. She lectures and offers workshops worldwide. Together with Christopher Germer, Dr. Neff hosts an 8-hour online course, The Power of Self-Compassion. Welcome, and thank you so much for being here with us, Kristin.
Oh, thank you, Kate. I feel very honored to be in such distinguished company. So thank you for having us.
Thank you. And now we're so lucky to have the other person who authored this book, Christopher Germer. He has a private practice in mindfulness and compassion-based psychotherapy in Arlington, Massachusetts. And he's a part-time lecturer on psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, Cambridge Health Alliance. He is a founder, faculty member of the Institute for Meditation and Psychotherapy and of the Center for Mindfulness and Compassion. His books include the Mindful Self-Compassion Workbook and the Mindful Path to Self-Compassion for the General Public, and Teaching the Mindful Self-Compassion Program, Wisdom and Compassion in Psychotherapy, and Mindfulness and Psychotherapy for Professionals. Dr. Germer lectures and leads workshops internationally. Thanks for being here with us, Chris.
Thank you, Kate. It's really great to be here.
And for those of you that just joined in, if you have any questions for our guest today, please type them into the chat box below and we'll be sending them through later in the program. Thanks for being here, and I'll let you take it from here, Michael.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you for those introductions. Chris and Kristin, welcome. When I was asked several months ago if I would be willing to facilitate this conversation, I jumped at the opportunity because your work is very well known to me. And I actually I first came across it about 6 years ago, and since then have been using it to teach undergraduates and graduate students, and it's had a huge influence on my work. So I am just thrilled to be here and just so grateful that you guys have taken the time to do this. I wanted to open up by just asking you the question of inspiration. You talk a little bit in the book about what motivated each of you to get into this work and to write the book, but I'd love it if you wouldn't mind each just sharing briefly kind of what inspires you, how you came to write the book, but also what keeps you going in terms of having been doing this work prior to writing the book, through the process of writing the book, and now continuing this work. And maybe we start with Kristin, maybe you'll start first, and sorry, you'll start first, and then we'll go to Chris.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, Chris and I come from a very similar place in that, for me, and also for him, it comes from a place of personal practice, right? So both of us learned about self-compassion, I think, as part of our meditation practice, our mindfulness meditation practice. And luckily for me, the first place I learned mindfulness meditation, the teacher who taught the course also talked about self-compassion. That was actually quite fortunate because not all mindfulness meditation teachers talk about self-compassion, but the one I went to did. And so I was just really struck by the immediate difference it made in my personal life. And so really for me, it came from a place of personal practice and seeing the benefits. And then because I was actually an academic, my field was self-concept development. And then so I started doing research on the topic, kind of trying to show how it has advantages over self-esteem, et cetera. But really the workbook, I mean, this comes out of this beautiful collaboration that Chris and I have had over the years. I like to joke that Chris is my most successful adult male relationship. We're a great team, and so we developed the Mindful Self-Compassion program. I think it's been 10 years now. I've been working on it. And, and Chris, really, I have to say, hats off to him. He's really taken the lead in developing the program. I mean, it's a true collaboration, but he's really put the blood, sweat, and tears in terms of, refining the protocol and figuring out the teacher training pathway. And so that's been, going very well, very well. We've got teachers all over the world. And in terms of writing the workbook in particular, and Chris can talk more about this as well, but we really thought long and hard about it because there are real advantages to people learning self-compassion with the guidance of a trained teacher. We were a little worried that if we just kind of throw the program out there open to the general public, will it be safe? Are people going to be able to learn the same skills? I think we're unsure, but I know certainly from my point of view, I'm so glad we did because it makes these tools that have been developed, honed over years, available to hundreds of thousands of people in a way that wouldn't have been otherwise. So I don't know, Chris, do you want to add to that?
Chris.
I know I spoke. Yeah. Sorry, but.
Yeah, you said a lot, and I just resonate with everything you're saying. Regarding the workbook, I think we consider it kind of an on-ramp. Hopefully people will get inspired to practice, and if they then want to practice in community, they'll find other practitioners or take a class. There's a lot of online opportunities. But in terms of my own interest, similar to Kristin, self-compassion really helped me in my own life. I often talk about my 20 years struggle with public speaking anxiety as a so-called, expert in anxiety disorders, and self-compassion was something really out of the box for me. And I until I started practice, I suffered from public speaking anxiety, and afterwards, really not so much, to the point that Kristin now thinks maybe it'd be good if I had a little anxiety, so it wouldn't take up so much space. I'll keep that in mind during this talk. At any rate, yeah, I'm also a clinical psychologist, and so after I personally learned the benefits of self-compassion, I started to look at the whole clinical field through that lens, and it really, so many things that were mysterious to me just sort of popped open, especially the issue of shame, which underlies so many difficulties that people have. But maybe I would say what really sustained me over time is my friendship and work with Kristin. That the collegiality has been just amazing. And then now we have a global community of teachers and practitioners, and it's just so nourishing. And all the stories we hear about transformation as a result of learning self-compassion is amazingly energizing. And maybe the last thing I'll say is that I think self-compassion is the easiest way to sustain compassion and even expand our circle of compassion for others. It's a little bit like, it's like falling in love, kind of falling into compassion. And if we want to expand our compassion for others, we really need to expand our compassion for ourselves. And so I think it's a really cost-effective way of responding to the challenges of life, and particularly the ones coming to our whole planet.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I love that connection. I want to explore that further if we have time, is that link between self-compassion and compassion, because although I've been familiar with the research side of your work, I had never really read something like the workbook, and I was kind of struck by how much it moves into things like compassion for others, forgiveness, empathic distress versus empathic concern. So I'd love to touch on all of that, but maybe first let's start with the basics. Is the definition that you have of self-compassion, and I'm also curious as to how that kind of went from the sitting on the cushion, so to speak, in the mindfulness course, and the current definitions that you have of having mindfulness, common humanity, and self-kindness. And was that self-evident right from that first sitting, or was that something that had to kind of come to you over time through practice? And I'll throw it to either one of you, whoever wants to answer.
Well, it's Kristin's definition, so
Yeah.
I'd love to hear her response to that question.
Compassion that way, right? So, and the kind of the universal definition of compassion is concern with the alleviation of suffering. But the two extra elements of common humanity and mindfulness certainly aren't in everyone's definition. And so that's, yeah. So, so compassion for others or self hadn't actually been defined in that particular way when I first wrote my definition of self-compassion. And so it's kind of something I put together based on my readings of other people's work. And actually, in particular, based on my readings of other people's work on compassion for others. Because even though, it comes from the Buddhist tradition, just to be honest about its roots, although there's, it's assumed that you include compassion for yourself as well as others, the idea to separate it just makes no sense. But people hadn't really written much about self-compassion. Most of the writings were about compassion for others and just kind of included the self. And so at first I just thought it was, the idea of being kind, just the kindness, the concern with the alleviation of suffering, more like metta meditation, loving kindness meditation. I had just focused on the kindness. But then I realized, well, first of all, if you don't have mindfulness there, you can't be compassionate, right? Unless you're, and even with other people's pain, if I'm not willing to tune in to your pain, if I just shut it out because it's either too distressing for me or I can't be bothered or, I'm avoiding it, I can't actually have compassion for you. And also I can't have compassion for me as well. So unless that foundation of awareness, not only awareness, but non-resistance, right? Because normally we don't want to be with suffering. It's just way too uncomfortable. And you have to be willing to be with suffering in order to have a compassionate response. And then so I realized, okay, you need mindfulness in there as well. And then I was reading actually a lot of Jack Kornfield. His beautiful book, A Path with Heart, was very influential. And he talks about, and other people as well, the difference between compassion and pity, right? And how they're near enemies. So pity is when you kind of feel sorry for someone, but there's a sense of separation. Whereas compassion is there's a, you know, we're in this together, this connectedness. And I really realized that, especially with self-compassion, if you didn't have that sense of common humanity, it could easily just be self-pity. We know self-pity is not a healthy emotion, right? So, and also we're learning about Buddhist practice and the idea of interdependence, and we're all part of this larger whole. I realized that without that kind of wisdom element, that self-compassion, you know, you could be kind to yourself, but it wouldn't be stable. It wouldn't be a stable practice over time if it devolves into self-pity. So that's where I came up with my 3-component model. And luckily it seems to have held up pretty well. And it's also nice because they're almost like steps you can do. Like, okay, first be mindful of my pain, and then remind myself that I'm not alone, that this is part of the human condition, and then be kind to myself. And I didn't actually intend it that way, to be steps in the process, but it actually can be used that way, which is quite helpful.
Well, and it's nice too, because it's got a lot of face validity in the sense that we can do lots of research on it, or we can just sit with it for a little bit, do some practices, and recognize, wow, this actually shows up in my life in this way, and it works, right? Exactly. So maybe Chris, you can share some additional thoughts on that if you have any.
Well, I do. I think when people think of compassion and self-compassion, they usually think about kindness, that particular element, and self-kindness in the case of self-compassion. And but the 3 components really need to coexist. They are they're kind of an integrated whole. But the sequence, I think, that Kristin identified is really key. If, as she said, if we don't know we're suffering, we can't have a compassionate response. And that quality of knowing, particularly with mindful knowing, which means kind of an accepting knowing, creates space for a new response. So often when we're suffering, it kind of makes us feel stressed or threatened. And threat just kind of narrows our perception and also narrows our options. But when we can be aware of what's happening in a spacious way, accepting way, in a mindful way, then we can have a new response. And so I think the second step, which is to recognize that I'm not alone, further opens the field, you know, because when we feel alone in our suffering, it really magnifies our suffering enormously. So by the time we get to self-kindness, if we've done these first 2 steps, we're actually open to it. You know, sometimes people try to throw kindness at suffering in order to make it go away. And that's really counterproductive. It's just another form of resistance, you know. But if the heart can crack open a little bit, and that is possible if we have a little perspective, then kindness is a more natural response, you know. It's sort of the kindness can kind of fall in. So I really, conceptually, I think it's really important to think of the 3 components as a unified whole. But I think it's really important to think of, how am I going to get to the kindness part? It's really good to start with the awareness part and the common humanity part, because then the kindness comes easily.
And I think that really came through in even the sequencing of the book and the sequencing of the concepts and practices, because I think what a lot of people think, right, is that, oh, self-compassion, that's about self-indulgence, that's about just being kind to yourself when you don't really, you know, want to get anything accomplished, or you're behaving badly, so I'll just, you know, slough it off as, oh, just, it's okay, you'll do better next time. And I really think, you know, what you're raising, Kristin, and the definition, Kristin, is so powerful, is the idea that this is about actually being present with your suffering, right? And taking it and treating yourself like you would that that good friend who is saying, you know, no, you don't want to have that another drink, or you don't want to just keep missing those deadlines, right? And so maybe you guys can talk a little bit about that, about how this is not self-indulgence, and that it's really about being more present to the suffering that you have, but in a way that is approachable and is healing.
Yeah, well, so I think what you're pointing to is the myths of self-compassion. So there are basically 5 common myths that come up over and over again. So people confuse self-compassion with pity. Self-pity, they don't understand common humanity. They think it's selfish, right? They don't understand, especially because of the common humanity, it actually reduces your sense of separation from others, increases your connection with others. People think it's self-indulgent. And of course, self-indulgence means choosing long-term harm at the expense of, you know, for short-term pleasure. And that's not caring about yourself and wanting to alleviate your suffering. So there's that confusion. And there's also the big confusion that it will undermine your motivation, make you lazy or irresponsible. That's where the research really helps, because we've got tons of research showing that it's the exact opposite, right? So self-compassion has you take more responsibility, not less responsibility, because it's safe to admit your mistakes. It helps you, again, be more connected in relationships because you have more resources to give. It makes you less self-focused, less self-pitying because you've got this mindfulness. And it makes you more motivated because when you accept yourself as you are, as kind of the bottom line, you're still going to want to reach your full potential if you care. But if you fail, you make a mistake, instead of just, you know, getting anxious or giving up, you can actually learn from that failure. And we know, everyone tells you failure is our best teacher, right? That's a truism. But how many of us have the emotional resources to really approach failure as your best teacher? Well, self-compassion gives you that resource. You can accept failure, you can learn from it, and that actually gives you the ability to not only try again, but it actually achieve more successfully. It's a much more effective motivator than self-criticism, for instance.
Yeah, that's great. And Chris, I know that you've got an ongoing practice and that you're mentoring and training others that have ongoing practices. How do you see that kind of what Kristin's referencing about coming out of the research? How do you see that happening in practice? If you could comment on that, maybe. In other words, are you seeing people in practice making that kind of shift of saying, okay, instead of this being about self-indulgence, I really see how I can be more present to this, and in that presence have the ability to say, you know, yeah, I want long-term benefit, and if I'm really going to be self-compassionate. Yeah,
I mean, what we often hear people say is it's like coming home. And one of the criteria that we offer a lot of different practices in the Mindful Self-Compassion Training Program, most of which are in the workbook. You know, there are 7 core practices, 20 informal practices, 14 exercises, 34 topics. It's a very full program. But what we say is ask yourself what works for you, and then practice what works for you, even customize it in a way that it works for you. But if we ask the question, how do I know what works for me? It's when the heart rests, when the heart can rest, you know. But the heart never rests in self-indulgence, you know. The heart rests in reality. The heart actually rests in vulnerability, which is our reality. The heart sometimes rests in not knowing. So this quality of the heart resting, I think, is really clear. If we're being self-indulgent, the reason we can't rest is because there's always a part of our mind saying, yeah, but you know, what about your loved ones? What about your body? What about, you know, that's not real care. Self-indulgence is not real care. As Kristin often says, you know, if your child came home and said, oh, mommy, I'd like a gallon of chocolate ice cream for dinner, would a loving mother say, oh, yes, honey.
Sounds like a great idea.
Yeah. Because you wanted a gallon of chocolate ice cream, you can have it because I love you. You know, no mother would do that, you know. So Why would we do that for ourselves? So we actually need to see things as they are and see as much of reality as it is and come to terms with that. And what mindful self-compassion does is allows us to be with reality as it is, especially the difficult parts. You know, and what we like to say is it's that mindfulness and self-compassion are like a dance, two people dancing together, you know, harmoniously, that you really can't have one without the other. And so the mindfulness part is seeing things as they are, and the compassion part adds this quality of warmth. And when things are really difficult in our lives, simply seeing things as they are usually is not enough to be with them fully. We need to warm things up. Just like when we have a difficulty and somebody who knows us really well listens to us deeply and holds us until we can settle down and start to see what's going on in our lives. So also we can do that for ourselves. We can give ourselves that warmth that we need so that the heart can rest, and then we can see things as they are, and then we can work with them.
That's beautifully put. And so how do the practices, because I know we're going to do a practice together in a second, so maybe you guys could talk about why the practices are so important. There's clearly a lot of them in the manual, very impressive number. And so why are they so important? And what do you recommend to people in terms of how they would practice? And again, I'll open it up to either of you.
You know, I'm sure we can both say something here. I mean, so self-compassion is a practice, right? It's not just an idea. You may understand it intellectually, but unless you practice it, and also practice it when you're suffering, right? It's not like something, self-compassion is not something you just do abstractly. It's the way you respond to yourself when you're suffering. And so it kind of has to be experienced in real life in order for it to be effective. And so practice is really the way to do that. I mean, there is intellectual understanding that helps to kind of provide a scaffold for understanding, you know, well, why might self-compassion be relevant, or understanding, for instance, oh, I see, if I fight this, it's probably going to make it worse. You know, so the intellectual understanding is important, but it's definitely not enough. And I'm so glad you picked up on the fact in the book, the practices are carefully sequenced. Mm-hmm. Chris and I spent years, you know, refining the program, driving everyone crazy because all our teachers wanted us just to settle. But it's like, no, we found out this works better. If we put this here, this lays the foundation for this later practice. And so they are very carefully sequenced so that if you do them in sequence, the practices one by one, by the time you get to the really difficult stuff, like working with shame, for instance, or working with challenging relationships, you really laid a solid foundation. You know, for people who have the workbook, we really do recommend they go in order if possible. And then that you spend at least, you know, 20 to 30 minutes a day practicing. It doesn't have to be meditating. Not everyone's a meditator. Meditation is great. It works. It reprograms the neuronal pathways. It's really effective. But equally effective, we find, is just people, oh gosh, I just had a really difficult interaction at work. Okay, maybe kind to myself in this moment. You know, remember, I'm not alone. This happens. Maybe present with the pain. So that type of practice, if you can just do that every time you struggle during your day, which is probably going to be at least 20 to 30 minutes, you're sorted, you know.
And I think that's, you know, another thing, just one of many things that I loved about it, in addition to the sequencing of the practices, was the variety and the fact that there are those informal practices. Because like you said, not everyone's going to be a meditator. And if every program is sit for 40 minutes a day and pay attention to your breath, then you're going to, just by nature of different people, you're going to lose a lot of people. So there's such a variety that makes it very achievable, I think. Chris, did you want to add anything on that topic? And I had one more question before I'll let you, we'll go into a practice.
I love Kristin's comment, you know, we're probably going to suffer at least 20 minutes a day. So practice. It's the first time I've heard you say that one. But it's true. Apropos the matter of practice versus just kind of thinking about it or reading about it, there's what we call a central paradox to practice, which is fundamental to whether or not a person experiences the transformative potential of self-compassion or not. And this core paradox it can be said, but you only know it through how it feels. And the core paradox is that when we suffer, we practice not to feel better, but because we feel bad. When people get this, they get the whole self-compassion training. This is one of the subtle messages that we hope people understand through practice, that when we suffer, we practice not to feel better, but because we feel bad. And anybody who starts self-compassion training does start in order to feel better. That's a totally legitimate agenda, but eventually we have to let it go and just basically learn to love ourselves because we're in pain, not as self-compassion as a strategy to get rid of pain. So the analogy is, if you have a child, say with a 5-day flu, that's a strange metaphor at these times of the coronavirus, but go, stick with me. If you have a child with a 5-day flu and it's the
I need to practice self-compassion right now.
and say all the children at school have the flu, it's day 1 for your child, and your child is moaning and complaining, you're not kind to the child to get rid of the flu. You know the flu is going to be there for 5 days. You're kind to the child because your heart just opens because the child is struggling, you know. And the metaphor is that all of us have the flu, and it's a lifelong flu, and it's called human suffering, you know. Whenever we suffer, what would it be like if our first response was tenderness of heart rather than, this shouldn't be like this, you know? Like even amoebas will pull away from salt or acid, you know? We are so much more complex. We pull away and try to avoid and struggle with an infinite array of difficult experiences. And actually that instinct tends to amplify our suffering. So this paradox, which is when we suffer, to practice just because we're suffering as a spontaneous kindness toward ourselves when we're suffering as the foundation for change, is absolutely essential. And we can only live this through if we practice.
I love that conceptualization of we practice because we are feeling bad, not because we want to get better. And I think that theme is throughout the book, in the sense that it's not like a lot of books that may be for self-care, which tend to be seemingly simple solutions that are going to make you feel happy all of a sudden. But yet, you know, the whole concept, which maybe we'll talk about after the practice, of backdraft and the stages of the practice that you outline in the book, I think are so realistic and affirming for people who are trying to take these steps. One thing I'll throw out there, I had an interesting conversation. I had in our master's program one year, we actually had a Tibetan Buddhist Rinpoche getting his master's in contemplative science and secular ethics. I was his advisor, which made me feel very small and very not up for the task. But we started talking about self-compassion in one of our courses. We were reading several of the articles on it that Kristin has written and others. And so he said, but this doesn't make sense to me, this idea of self-compassion. He says, yeah, I say critical things to myself sometimes, but I really don't mean it. And I say, say more about that. And he said, well, think about it. He says, I got up this morning and I bathed myself. I clothed myself. I fed myself. I made sure to get to class on time. He says, I think if people spend, 99% of their day taking care of themselves. If you tried to hit me, I would jump out of the way instinctively. Isn't that self-compassion? And his suggestion was that this idea that we don't have self-compassion is part of an illusion, right? It's part of our own distortion of reality, that we're really maybe focusing too much on those times that we're critical of ourselves and not the vast amount of time that we care for ourselves. So I was just throwing that out there because I was a bit stumped in the moment. I think I tried to dance a little bit, but I'd love to hear your response to that. And then I would love us to maybe segue into one of the practices so that everyone gets a chance to experience your great work.
Well, I'll respond if you want to lead the practice, Chris. Does that work?
Oh, sure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's interesting. And so actually, a lot of traditional Buddhists, again, they aren't so enamored by the idea of self-compassion. In fact, a lot of people have a negative reaction. Isn't self the problem? So it's kind of assumed, well, of course, compassion includes the self. And, so it's almost like by calling it self-compassion, there's a sense of, aren't you just reifying the separation? But I think, so in some cultures, that's the case. But by the way, not all Asian cultures, for instance, self-criticism is a huge source of suffering, especially in more Confucian cultures like China or Taiwan, even more so than in the West. So it's not an East-West thing. But, and in some ways, yes, the sense of separate self is an illusion. And the idea of self-criticism, we aren't good enough, it's all an illusion. And so self-compassion, in many ways, compassion itself is a relative practice. In other words, if I'm understanding that I'm not separate from the rest of the world and I've got this sense of oneness, I don't need self-compassion because I'm not suffering,
Right.
And so it's a practice that's really designed to help people who are caught in the illusion of separate self and who are judging that illusion. And it's a way of freeing yourself from that illusion. It doesn't reify the illusion. It actually helps free you from it, especially through the mindfulness and the insight into common humanity. And I also have to say, how can I put this? Without the risk of offending anyone, I've noticed sometimes people can use a little bit of spiritual bypass with particularly Buddhist practices. I'm just going to avoid the pain by going straight to my oneness with everything.
Right, jump straight to nirvana.
From my point of view, the only way out is through. We need to embrace the mess before we transcend the mess. And so if you try to transcend without going through it, I think it can cause some problems, and so I don't know, that just saying that, I think just because someone's having a particular practice doesn't necessarily mean that they are, I'll leave it at that. I'll leave it at that.
And I think to your point, I think the practices that you're talking about can help. There's a part of the manual of the workbook where you're talking about kind of praising yourself, right, for the things you do. And I think that's linked to that kind of practice of saying, getting over that distortion of reality that, boy, I do a lot of things well, and I even take care of myself well. And maybe, so I think it's all in there. So, okay, so without much more delay, we're going to turn it to Chris for a practice, and then we're going to turn it over to questions from the folks in the audience. And I could talk to you guys for days, so maybe there won't be any questions and I get to ask mine, but we'll see. Thanks, Chris.
If I could just add, if I were speaking with the Rinpoche, I would think, Rinpoche doesn't really need self-compassion practice that much, because one thing that people often say after the mindful self-compassion training program, in terms of what did you get out of it, they say, it gave me permission to love myself, and it was a reminder to love myself. The Rinpoche didn't need permission or reminding. He already had what we would call omnidirectional compassion. He saw the validity of outer and inner kindness. But our experience is that most people that we're working with throughout the planet, no matter what the continent is, actually need permission to be kind to themselves and actually need to be shown the way. So I totally appreciate what Rinpoche said, and he wouldn't be somebody who needs a self-compassion training course.
Yeah, I was very struck by his comment because it didn't resonate with my own personal experience, but it was just such a, and it actually helped me think, well, I do those things for myself. Boy, that's some good self-compassion.
Yeah. So you, a little taste. We'll try to do
Yeah,
this
please.
in maybe 5 or 10 minutes, something like that. Yeah, so wherever you are listening in on this program, please find a comfortable position where you can be for 5 or 10 minutes without any unnecessary pain. And that's all, you know, we've been focusing on words and thinking and everything so much. Let's take some nice deep breaths, nice deep relaxing breaths. And as you take your breaths, also just really feel what it's like to breathe. It brings us into the present moment. And then I'd like to invite you to think about a problem that you're having in your life right now. It could be a problem related to the current virus, some additional stress that's been brought into your life, or it could be a work problem, a financial problem, health problem. But please think of some problem in your life that's mild to moderate, not a big problem right now. If you choose a big problem, you won't be able to stick with this practice. So just a mild problem, but a problem that's big enough that makes you think, ooh, it doesn't feel that good to think about this. And when a problem comes to mind and you've kind of settled on that one, I'd like you to visualize it as clearly as you can. If there are any people involved, or is there a place, in such a way that you can actually feel the distress associated with it. And so now we're going to be doing what we call the self-compassion break, and it has 3 components that correspond to the 3 components of self-compassion. The first is mindfulness. So in this moment, I'd like you to please just validate for yourself that this is a problem and that it's difficult. Like, oh, this hurts. Maybe even feeling in your body the stress that arises when you think about this problem. Validating it. Yeah, this is tough. Perhaps even making a little room for this experience in your body right in this present moment. Like, yeah, this is so. And then part 2, common humanity, is, and you know, a lot of people in my situation would probably feel exactly the same way. This is how it feels to be in a situation like this. This is a part of living. Actually, struggle or stress is a part of living, as it is a part of my life right now. And then, if you like, if it feels right, to place your hand on the part of the body that you might feel the stress the most, like maybe it's in your belly, maybe it's in your heart, maybe it's in your neck, wherever it may be, just physically touching that part of your body, maybe even gently rubbing that part of your body, or giving some gentle pressure with your hand. Basically tenderly touching your body as if it was the body of a young child. This is the third component of self-compassion or kindness, but we're expressing it first physically. And imagine that you had a dear friend who was struggling in a similar way. What you might say to your friend heart to heart. In other words, not to fix it, not to give advice, but just heart to heart. You know, what would you say to a friend? Like, oh, I'm here for you. I love you. I believe in you. I trust you. You've got this. I've got your back. What kind of things might you say to a friend who were in exactly the same situation? Heart to heart. If there were one simple message you'd like your friend to hear from you, what would that be? And now seeing if you can offer yourself the same message. If you can, as it were, whisper into your own ear the same message over and over again, just saying the same words to yourself, feeling the gentle touch or supportive touch of your hand, and speaking these words to yourself. Seeing if you can let them in. Maybe they go in, maybe they don't. Doesn't matter, just offering yourself this kind of kindness, just for now. Noticing how it feels to do that. Maybe it's easy, maybe it's difficult. Just noticing what it's like in your own experience right now. Allowing it to be just as it is. And if only for this moment, allowing yourself, your experience, and your life in this moment to be just as it is. And now slowly releasing the practice. And before you open your eyes, just to recap what we did. First was mindful awareness. In other words, yes, this hurts. And allowing it to be so, if we could, just for a moment, a little space around it. Part two is knowing that this is part of the human experience. Whatever you were feeling in that moment is shared by others. And part three, a little kindness, just because life is difficult. Kindness physically, kindness verbally. Then when it feels right, to slowly open your eyes.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
So it looks like I don't want to like charge right in since that was such a beautiful moment. But we do have some questions that have been sent to us from our audience, so I wanted to share those with you. So Teresa asks, could Kristin please respond? Could you share how you reconcile self-compassion with the Buddhist concept of no self?
Yes. So, common humanity, I wanted to call it interbeing. Common humanity actually is no self. No self is one of the essential components of self-compassion, but it's framed in a way that most people can understand, bigger than me, interdependence, connection. But when you grow in self-compassion, you're actually going more towards no self. Because when we criticize ourselves, we blame ourselves, we want to control things, that's when self is very, the illusion of self is very strong. When we start to accept things the way we are, when we start to have this kind of unconditional love that's not contingent on circumstances, right? And when we recognize that, because in common humanity, there's all like interdependent causes, conditions, all of that. When we really go deeply enough into common humanity, that is the understanding of no self. So it's right there, baby.
That's a great answer. Thank you.
It's
Great.
hidden, because I couldn't call it no self. I mean, how are you going to measure that?
Exactly. Right. So, and I'll give you a couple more questions here. We have one from Ellen that says, what special techniques or concerns should be considered regarding self-compassion during this present crisis? How, for example, do those in high-risk groups deal with guilt for not being able to help during this time of need? For anyone not being able to comfort a sick or dying loved one in hospital? For protecting ourselves to the exclusion of caring for others? It's a really important question. Chris, do you want to take a shot at that?
Well, the reality is that if we don't care for ourselves, we cannot sustain our care for others. And that's a simple fact. And there might be all sorts of pressures and old messages, and people could call the frontline people heroes, and indeed they are heroes, but does that mean you're not allowed to go home and sleep and not be a hero? The simple fact is that we have to continuously care for ourselves if we're going to be able to care for others. And so we need to give ourselves permission to do this. And people will find that they do better for others. Apropos the guilt, we have a really lovely practice for caregivers called giving and receiving compassion. It's kind of based on Tonglen, but the idea is allowing every in-breath to be for ourselves and every out-breath and every out-breath for another person. And the very first breath that we take as human beings on this planet is an in-breath. And when we take that in-breath, everybody who's at that birth is thrilled that we're taking an in-breath. And actually, the people we're caring for now want us to still breathe in for ourselves. We must care for ourselves. In for ourselves and out for others. It's a very natural balance. And if we give up that balance, all sorts of things are going to happen in our heads, such as guilt and stress, and our bodies are going to break down, and we're not going to be able to sustain our efforts. So all I can say is, please, please, please care for yourself.
I think,
Yeah,
go ahead, Kristin.
I have a video of that practice on my website for caregivers in particular, if anyone wants to.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, I was wondering, that's another question I had, which we'll never get to, which is, was that based on Tonglen? So I'm glad you mentioned that. But the other thing is, I think it dovetails really beautifully into what Kristin was saying too, because this is a time when I think in some ways, if we reify the self too much, then it's about what can I do? And I have that impetus to want to do. But if we think about it in terms of interdependence and inner being, the fact that I am holding back as part of this whole is my job right now, right? And so I should feel very good about the fact that I am, interdependence is never more apparent than it is right at this moment, that my actions or inactions can affect the whole in very dramatic ways. I think we have time for one more question. And this is from my friend.
Can I just add one little thing?
Yeah, please, Chris.
Michael, and that is that interdependence is insight is wisdom. You know, there's the wisdom
Yes.
of interdependence. It's the seeing how we can't exist without one another. But interdependence, the insight is not enough. What we also need is the emotional or the motivational aspect of interdependence, which is caring. And that's where compassion comes in, you know. So we really want to be able to activate the heart around the insight of interdependence and actually then do something, you know. But do something that is that doesn't lose the sense of interdependence, which is to be very humble and to participate in this global work that we're doing in a way that our compassion includes ourselves. You know, when we're very humble, we can care for ourselves as much as we care for others. And that is the same thing as interdependence with an activated heart.
And speaking of an activated heart, my friend Charles asks, and this will have to be a short answer, which is, what are the differences between a traditional metta practice, a loving kindness practice, and MSC? And you know, where do you see the overlaps or distinctions?
So we do teach traditional loving kindness meditation in MSC. I have to say, Chris made a brilliant adaptation because he helps people find phrases that speak particularly to them.
Yeah, I love that.
Very, very meaningful, juicy phrases, because the traditional ones work for some people, they don't work for others. You know, may be safe, may be happy, etc. But loving kindness doesn't necessarily include suffering. So because it's self-compassion, we're constantly bringing up suffering. So people, you know, basically, if loving kindness meets suffering and stays loving, then it manifests as compassion. So we focus a little bit more on the pain for that reason, because it's hard to stay present with pain.
Yeah, thank you. And I love that adaptation. It's really makes it so much more meaningful. Kate, back
Hi.
to you.
Thank you. I want to thank all of you for being here with us today and sharing your wisdom and insights into self-compassion, and Michael, for your amazing hosting of this program. So thank you, Chris. Thank you, Kristin. Thank you, Michael. And I want to thank everyone for being here with us today. Appreciate your kindness and compassion and wisdom. And I just am excited to announce, you know, again, that I will be putting, I'll be saving the chat, and then I will make sure that that gets sent to you. People who are have the recording sent to them will also get the chat, because people are asking about that, because there was links in there and different comments that people wanted to have. So thank you so much. Have a wonderful day, and namaste.
Thank you all so much. Please stay healthy and stay safe.
Thanks,
Just
Kate.
thank you so much for the amazing work Charter for Compassion does. I'm a member. You guys are just amazing. So much for your existence.
Saving the
For
world.
that.
Thank you
Thanks
so
so
much.
much.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.